What if the greatest lie you have ever believed is the one that makes you feel the safest? Dear brothers and sisters, tonight I ask you to listen not with your ears, but with your soul, because what you are about to hear is not just a story. It is a warning that echoes in eternity, a whisper that has followed humanity from the beginning of time, hidden behind comfort, disguised as faith, and accepted by millions without question. Imagine for a moment a quiet church on a Sunday night somewhere in Middle America. The rain tapping gently against stained glass windows, the soft glow of candles flickering across wooden pews polished by generations of believers, the air filled with hymns that rise like incense, voices united, hands lifted, hearts seemingly surrendered. Everything appears holy, everything appears right. And yet, what if beneath that peace, beneath that worship, beneath those whispered prayers, something is terribly wrong? What if heaven is not responding the way we think it is? What if the silence above is not approval, but warning? There are people sitting in that church who know the name of Jesus, who have spoken it for years, who have built their identity around it, who have told themselves again and again, "I believe." And yet there is a truth so unsettling, so deeply uncomfortable, that most never dare to confront it, a truth that cuts through tradition, through routine, through surface-level faith, and exposes something far more serious, something eternal. You see, belief alone can become a refuge, a place where we hide from deeper transformation, a place where we convince ourselves that knowledge equals salvation, that saying the right words means the heart has been changed. But what if that belief, untouched by repentance, untouched by surrender, untouched by true grace, is not a bridge to light, but a veil that keeps us in darkness? Brothers and sisters, this is not about those outside the church. This is not about those who reject God openly. This is about those who sit in the pews, who sing the songs, who carry the Bible, who say, "Lord, Lord," and yet somewhere deep within, something remains unchanged, something remains distant, something remains unbroken before God. And tonight, as the rain falls and the candles burn low, there is a question that rises above the hymns, above the comfort, above the illusion of safety, a question that each of us must face whether we are ready or not. Not tomorrow, not someday, but now, in this very moment, because eternity does not wait, and truth does not soften itself to make us comfortable. What if believing in Jesus is not the same as truly knowing him? What if faith without transformation is not faith at all? What if the most dangerous place a soul can be is thinking it is already safe? Daniel Whitmore sat 3 rows from the front, his hands resting calmly on a worn leather Bible, his posture straight, his expression composed, the kind of man people nodded to with quiet respect as they passed by in the aisle. He had built a life that looked right from the outside, a house in a quiet neighborhood, a steady career, a reputation for being reliable, disciplined, and above all, faithful. Every Sunday without fail he occupied the same seat, sang the same hymns, listened to the same sermons, and whispered the same prayers that had become as familiar to him as breathing. And if anyone had asked, he would have said with complete confidence that he believed in Jesus Christ, not just casually, but firmly, unshakably, because belief for Daniel had never been in question. It was the foundation he stood on, the identity he carried, the assurance that gave him peace at night. Yet there was another side to Daniel that few ever saw, a quieter world behind closed doors where patience wore thin, where old grudges lingered like shadows that refused to leave, where forgiveness was something he spoke about, but rarely practiced, and where pride settled deep into his heart in ways so subtle he no longer recognized it. He did not think of himself as lost, not even close. In fact, he often compared himself to others and found comfort in the differences. He was not reckless, not openly rebellious, not someone who had abandoned faith, and so slowly, over the years, a quiet assumption formed within him, an assumption that his belief alone was enough, that knowing the truth was the same as living it, that acknowledging Jesus was the same as surrendering to him. And this belief wrapped around his life like a shield, protecting him not only from doubt, but also from deeper reflection, because as long as he believed, he never felt the urgency to change, the urgency to confront the parts of himself that resisted grace, resisted humility, resisted transformation. And so he continued, week after week, year after year, standing in worship while something within him remained untouched, listening to sermons that stirred others to tears while his own heart stayed composed, almost distant, as though the message was always meant for someone else, until this night, when the rain fell heavier against the windows, when the flicker of candlelight seemed less steady, and when the words spoken from the pulpit carried a weight he could not ignore, a weight that began to press gently at first, then more firmly, against the quiet certainty he had built his life upon, because for the first time, something inside him began to shift, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to make him feel a discomfort he could not explain, as though a question long buried had finally found its way to the surface, a question that did not accuse, but did not comfort either, a question that lingered in the silence between each breath, asking without words whether belief without change was ever meant to be enough. Pastor Elias stood at the pulpit with a stillness that seemed to quiet even the sound of the rain, his voice not loud, not forceful, but carrying a weight that settled into the room like something unseen yet undeniable. And as he opened the worn pages of his Bible, his eyes moved slowly across the congregation, not as a man looking at a crowd, but as a shepherd searching for something deeper, something hidden beneath appearances. And when he finally spoke, the words did not rush forward. They unfolded, measured and deliberate. Not everyone who says to me, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven. And for a moment, the familiar verse passed through the room like many had heard it before, recognized, acknowledged, and then set aside. But this time, something was different, something in the tone, something in the silence that followed, as though the words were not simply being read, but revealed, and Daniel felt it immediately, a subtle tightening in his chest, not pain, not fear exactly, but an awareness, as though the words had bypassed his ears and reached directly into a place he rarely allowed anything to touch. And as the pastor continued, explaining that there are those who speak the language of faith yet never allow it to shape their lives, Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers pressing more firmly against the edge of his Bible, because the certainty that had always comforted him now felt less solid, less unshakable, and he could not explain why. The rooms seemed the same, the people around him unchanged, yet something within him had begun to move, slowly, quietly, like a door that had been closed for years now opening just enough to let in a thin line of light. And then it happened. The flame of a candle near the front flickered once, twice, and then went out completely, a small detail that most did not notice, but Daniel did, his eyes drawn to it without understanding. And as he looked toward the cross above the altar, something about it seemed different, not physically altered, but heavier, more present, as though it was no longer just a symbol, but a witness. And in that moment, the words of the pastor seemed to echo again. Not everyone, not everyone, not everyone, each repetition pressing deeper into his thoughts, breaking through the quiet assumptions he had carried for so long. And for the first time, a question formed clearly in his mind, not as a passing thought, but as something that demanded to be faced. What if belief is not the same as surrender? What if knowing the truth is not the same as living it? And as that question took shape, the atmosphere around him seemed to shift, the air heavier, the silence more pronounced, as though the room itself was waiting, and Daniel could feel it, not in a dramatic way, not like a sudden shock, but like a growing awareness that something real was unfolding beneath the surface, something he could no longer ignore, and for reasons he could not fully understand. He felt as though he was being seen, not by the people around him, not by the pastor at the pulpit, but by something far deeper, something that knew every thought he had ever justified, every moment he had dismissed, every part of his life that had remained unchanged despite all the years he claimed to believe. And the comfort he once held so tightly now began to loosen its grip, replaced by a quiet, unsettling realization that faith, if it is real, must reach beyond words, beyond routine, beyond appearance, into the very core of who a person is. And as the rain continued to fall against the windows and the remaining candles flickered in the dim light, Daniel sat there, no longer as certain as he had been before, no longer as untouched as he had believed himself to be, because something had begun, something that would not easily be silenced, and deep within him, The first cracks in his certainty had begun to form. The pastor's voice softened, yet somehow carried even further, as though each word was being placed with intention into the silence that surrounded them. And he began to speak not in general terms, but in a way that felt uncomfortably specific, describing a kind of life that looked faithful on the outside but remained untouched within, a life where habits replaced transformation, where routine replaced relationship, where the appearance of devotion quietly masked a heart that had never truly surrendered. And as Daniel listened, something began to unfold in his mind, not as imagination, but as a vivid awareness that seemed to overlay the present moment. The wooden pew beneath him felt distant, the sound of rain softened, and in its place he saw something else, something beneath the surface of the room, as though reality itself had opened to reveal a deeper layer. And suddenly the people around him no longer appeared as they had before. They were still seated, still singing, still bowing their heads, but around them flickered a faint glow, like small flames hovering near their chests, some steady and warm, others dim and fragile, barely holding their light, and a few that seemed almost extinguished, producing more shadow than illumination. And Daniel's breath slowed as he watched, unable to look away, because this was not a vision of judgment, not yet, but a revelation of truth, a glimpse into something that had always been present but never seen. And as the pastor continued speaking about the difference between knowing Christ and being transformed by him, Daniel's eyes moved from one person to another, recognizing faces he had known for years, people he had admired, people he had quietly compared himself to. And yet now, in this strange and silent unveiling, their outward lives no longer told the full story, because what mattered here was not what they said, not what they did in public, but what remained alive within them. And then, slowly, almost hesitantly, Daniel became aware of his own presence in this unseen layer, as though something invited him to look inward, not at the image he presented to others, but at the reality within his own soul. And at first he resisted, his mind searching for distraction, for something familiar to hold on to. But the awareness did not leave. It remained patient, unwavering, until he could no longer avoid it. And when he finally looked, what he saw was not what he expected, not a bright flame like he had always assumed, not a steady light that confirmed his certainty, but something far more unsettling, a faint and uneven glow, flickering in a way that revealed inconsistency. Moments of warmth followed by stretches of dimness, as though the light within him depended not on something constant, but on something temporary, something external. And with that realization came a quiet understanding that settled deep into his thoughts. That belief, the belief he had trusted for so long, had not reached the places within him that needed it most. It had informed his mind, shaped his words, guided his routine, but it had not fully transformed his heart. And as that truth began to take hold, the atmosphere around him seemed to grow heavier, not oppressive, but weighty with meaning, as though every moment, every decision, every hidden thought carried a significance he had never fully considered. And the question that had begun to form earlier now returned with greater clarity, no longer distant, no longer avoidable, asking not what he believed, but who he had become because of it. And as the remaining candles flickered and the quiet rhythm of the rain continued outside, Daniel sat in stillness, no longer observing others, but confronted with something far more personal, the undeniable reality that faith, if it is real, must be alive, must burn steadily, must endure beyond convenience and beyond appearance. And for the first time in his life, he was no longer certain that his did. The weight of that realization had barely settled when the atmosphere shifted again, not abruptly, but with a quiet inevitability, as though something deeper was unfolding beneath the surface of what Daniel could see. And suddenly the faint glow surrounding each person in the room began to change, not in brightness alone, but in meaning, as if what had been revealed as a condition was now being measured against something unseen. And Daniel felt it before he understood it, a presence that did not announce itself with sound or movement, but with authority, a stillness so profound it seemed to hold everything in place. And in that stillness, the space before the altar appeared to open, not physically, but in a way that felt more real than anything he had ever known, like a threshold between what is seen and what is eternal, And within that space, a figure stood, not distant, not abstract, but unmistakably present, radiant yet gentle, carrying a light that did not flicker like the candles, but remained steady, unchanging, and Daniel knew without being told that this was not a symbol, not an idea, but the very presence of Christ. And though there were no spoken words, everything within Daniel responded as if a question had been asked, a question that did not require explanation because it reached beyond language. And as he looked around, he saw that others were being drawn toward that presence, not physically moving, but revealed in relation to it. And this is where the realization deepened into something far more unsettling, because those who seemed closest were not always the ones he expected. Some whose outward devotion had appeared strong now seemed distant, their faint light unable to approach, while others, quieter, less noticeable, carried a steady warmth that drew them nearer. And Daniel watched as a pattern began to emerge, not one based on knowledge, not on reputation, not on how often someone had spoken the name of Jesus, but on something far more inward, something rooted in truth. And then his attention was drawn to a movement he could not ignore, as though something beneath the surface of the room itself was responding to the same presence, a subtle separation forming, not visible to the eye alone, but felt in the atmosphere, where light gathered toward one direction and shadow toward another. And Daniel's heart began to race, not from fear of harm, but from the growing awareness that what he was witnessing was not symbolic, not hypothetical, but real in a way that transcended everything he had believed faith to be. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, he saw something that shook him to the core. Those whose light flickered weakly were not simply remaining where they were. They were slowly, almost imperceptibly, being drawn away from the presence he now longed for, not by force, not by violence, but by the natural consequence of what they had become, as though their own condition determined their direction and the distance between them. And that steady light grew wider, and Daniel felt a deep unease rise within him, because he could sense that this was not about a single moment, not about a single choice, but about the accumulated reality of a life either shaped by surrender or held back by resistance. And as he stood there within this unfolding revelation, the question that had once felt distant now pressed upon him with undeniable clarity, not asking what he believed, but revealing what his belief had produced. And for the first time, he could not answer it with confidence. And then, as the distance between light and shadow became impossible to ignore, something even more precise began to unfold, not just a separation, but a revelation of why, as if the unseen reality itself was now being explained without words. And Daniel found that he could understand it, not through reasoning, but through a clarity that settled directly into his awareness. And what he saw next did not come as a sudden shock, but as a series of undeniable truths rising one after another, each one exposing a layer he had never questioned before. He saw a man who had stood faithfully in that same church for decades, always present, always attentive. Yet within him lingered a quiet refusal to forgive someone who had wronged him years ago, and that refusal, small as it once seemed, had slowly shaped his heart, closing it off, hardening it, dimming the light that once burned brighter. And Daniel understood in that moment that belief had lived in that man's mind, but grace had not been allowed to fully enter his heart. Then another image formed, a woman known for her devotion, her prayers spoken with sincerity, her service admired by many. Yet beneath that devotion there remained a hidden attachment, a subtle prioritizing of comfort, reputation, and control. And though she believed, though she served, there were parts of her life she had never truly surrendered, parts she kept untouched, and those untouched places had quietly weakened the life within her. And again Daniel saw the pattern, not dramatic rebellion, not open rejection, but something far more subtle, a division between what was confessed and what was lived. And as each life unfolded before him, the same truth echoed again and again. Belief alone had never been the issue. The issue was what that belief had been allowed to change. And then, as if guided by something beyond his will, Daniel was drawn into the memory of his own life, not as a sequence of events, but as a reflection of choices, moments where he had felt the quiet prompting to forgive but chose to hold on, Moments where he sensed the need to humble himself but chose instead to protect his image. Moments where truth called him deeper but he remained at the surface, content with what was familiar. And as these moments passed before him, they did not accuse him. They revealed him, showing not what he had claimed, but what he had become over time, and the realization settled heavily within him that his belief had never truly been absent, but it had often remained unchallenged, untested, and therefore unchanged. And in that realization came a deeper understanding, one that reached beyond fear into something more sobering, that a life can be built around faith and still resist transformation, that a person can stand near truth and yet never fully step into it. And as this truth unfolded, Daniel no longer looked outward, no longer compared himself to others, because the question had become entirely personal, entirely unavoidable, not whether he believed, but whether his life reflected the reality of that belief, whether grace had been allowed to shape him, whether surrender had truly taken place. And as the steady light of the presence before him remained unchanged, constant, and unwavering, Daniel stood within that clarity, no longer shielded by assumption, no longer comforted by routine, but faced with a truth that was both simple and profound. That belief without transformation does not lead where he had always assumed it would. And just as that truth settled into him, something happened that he could not have prepared for, something that moved beyond observation and into direct confrontation, because the presence before him, steady and unchanging, now turned toward him in a way that felt deeply personal, not as a distant figure among many, but as one who saw him completely. And in that moment, Daniel felt every layer of his life laid bare, not exposed with harshness, but revealed with a clarity that left no room for illusion. And though no audible words were spoken, there was a question that formed within him with undeniable authority, a question that did not accuse yet could not be ignored, asking him not what he had believed, but why he had stopped short of surrender. And Daniel felt something rise within him, a response he had carried for years, the same quiet defense that had always reassured him. And without thinking, he answered in his heart, "I believed, I stayed, I followed, I did what was right." And for a brief moment, that answer seemed enough, familiar and structured, built on everything he had always trusted. But as quickly as it came, it began to dissolve, not because it was entirely false, but because it was incomplete. And in its place came a deeper understanding, one that reached beyond his words into the reality of his life. And suddenly, as if drawn from the depths of memory itself, a single moment appeared before him, not extraordinary, not dramatic, but unmistakably significant. A quiet evening years ago when he had felt the clear and gentle call to forgive someone who had wronged him. A moment where he had sensed the presence of grace inviting him to release the bitterness he held, and yet he had turned away from it, justifying his decision, telling himself that time would resolve it, that it was not necessary, that belief alone was enough. And as that moment faded, another appeared, then another, each one revealing a pattern, not of rejection, but of hesitation, of partial surrender, of holding back just enough to remain unchanged. And Daniel felt the weight of it, not as condemnation, but as truth. And then, in a moment that seemed to suspend everything around him, he became aware of something he had not noticed before, his own name, not written in light, not shining with certainty, but present in a way that felt uncertain, as though it stood between two realities, neither fully aligned with the light before him nor entirely lost in the distance. And with that awareness came a realization that shook him more deeply than anything he had seen, that his life had been built not on open rebellion, but on quiet resistance, not on disbelief, but on incomplete surrender, and that this place, this moment, was revealing exactly where that path had led. And for the first time, the confidence he had always carried was gone, replaced by something far more honest, a recognition that belief without transformation had left him standing on uncertain ground. And as he looked again toward the presence before him, the light remained unchanged, not moving closer, not turning away, but waiting, as though everything now rested on a response he could no longer delay. And in that stillness, Daniel understood that this was the moment he had unknowingly avoided his entire life, the moment where belief must become surrender, where knowledge must become transformation, where faith must become real, and nothing within him could remain hidden any longer. And in that stillness, where nothing could be hidden and nothing could be pretended, Daniel felt something shift, not around him, but within him, because for the first time, he was no longer trying to justify his life, no longer reaching for familiar answers, no longer holding onto the quiet confidence that had once defined him. Instead, there was a breaking, not outward, not visible, but deep within the core of who he was, as though the layers he had built over the years were finally giving way to something more real. And as that breaking took place, the presence before him did not move away, did not withdraw, but remained steady, unwavering, filled not with condemnation, but with a kind of clarity that invited response. And Daniel understood then that this moment was not about being rejected, but about being revealed, not about proving himself, but about surrendering himself. And for the first time, the word repentance was no longer an idea, no longer a concept he had heard from sermons or repeated in prayer. It became something living, something necessary, something that reached into every part of his life and asked him to let go of what he had held on to for so long. And in that realization, he saw that grace had always been near, always available, not distant, not reserved for the perfect, but waiting for a heart that would truly open. And yet he had remained at the edge, close enough to recognize it, but never stepping fully into it. And now, standing in this moment, he felt the weight of that distance, not as punishment, but as truth. And something within him responded, not with fear alone, but with a longing, a deep and undeniable desire to be changed, not to appear different, not to return to routine, but to become something new, something real. And as that longing took shape, he found himself no longer silent, not speaking outwardly, but within his heart, where words formed with a sincerity he had never known before, not rehearsed, not structured, but honest. And in that honesty, there was no defense, no comparison, no justification, only a simple acknowledgement of what had been missing and a willingness to release it. And as he let go, not all at once, but in that moment with everything he could, something began to change, subtle at first, like the faintest increase of light, but undeniable, because what had once flickered within him now steadied, not by his own effort, but by something greater, something that responded to surrender with grace and the distance he had felt before. The separation that had seemed so clear no longer held the same power, not because it disappeared completely, but because a new direction had been set, one not defined by past resistance, but by present surrender. And as the steady light before him remained unchanged, Daniel understood that this was what had always been offered, not a life built on knowing about truth, but a life transformed by it, not a faith that rested on words, but one that lived in reality. And though the moment felt immense, beyond time, beyond explanation, it carried with it a quiet assurance, not that everything was complete, but that something real had begun, something that could no longer be undone by habit or routine, because it was rooted not in what he claimed, but in what he had finally allowed himself to become. And then, just as quietly as it had begun, the unseen began to recede, not disappearing abruptly, but folding back into the ordinary world as though the veil that had been lifted was now being gently lowered again. And Daniel found himself once more in the wooden pew, the familiar scent of old wood and candle wax returning, the soft echo of rain tapping against the stained glass windows filling the space, and the distant voice of Pastor Elias continuing as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet everything within Daniel had changed, because what he had seen was not a dream, not an illusion, but a truth that now lived within him, a truth that could not be forgotten or set aside. And as he looked around the church, the faces appeared the same. The hymns continued, the routine remained intact, but he could no longer see them as he once had, because now he understood that beneath every appearance lies a deeper reality, a reality not defined by what is spoken, but by what is lived. And as that understanding settled into him, he became aware of something else, something both simple and profound, that the moment he had just experienced was not reserved for him alone. It was not a singular event meant only to awaken one man, but a reflection of a truth that reaches into every life, every heart, Every person who has ever believed and yet hesitated to surrender fully. And as that realization deepened, Daniel felt a quiet urgency, not driven by fear alone, but by clarity, because he now knew that time, so often taken for granted, is not endless.